Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much for the invitation, Clark, and for your time. I really appreciate it. As Clark mentioned, my career began with the National Audubon Society, so I definitely hold anything Audubon with a special place in my heart. So I'm really excited to talk about these fun little birds. Again, I've been with Bird Conservancy for 9 years, and I started with Mountain Plover early in my career here for the first several years. I still work with this species, but more at a broader capacity. And I've just been able to engage with other opportunities within the organization. So today I'm going to talk about this rare and declining species, including touching on an innovative technique that we employed for more than a decade, where we located and marked nests on farm ground. And then I'm just going to touch on some other just general fun stuff. All right, so you may or may not be familiar with our organization, but our basic mission is to conserve birds and their habitats through an integrated approach of science, education, and land stewardship. And we operate across both breeding and wintering, and we're really trying to focus also in migratory ranges where there's a lot of information gap on many species in decline. And we've had a large presence in Mexico for oh gosh, 20 years or so, because the wintering grounds for many of our grassland birds are so crucial, and a lot more information is coming to light, giving us some indication of where declines might be occurring throughout their annual cycle. So I'm on our stewardship team, and we employ anywhere from 12 to 14 biologists, and they're based out of USDA Natural Resource Conservation Service field offices. And those offices work directly with private farmers and ranchers, usually through operating with diverse funding sources, particularly with funds from the USDA Farm Bill, to employ various habitat projects, restoration, and conservation of private working lands, which are actually quite vital for many of our grassland birds that inhabit private lands throughout the West. And part of our goal is something like what you see here, where we'd like to achieve healthy grasslands, working ranching operations that are viable and sustainable, and then home for grassland birds that depend on these areas. So I'm going to touch on a little bit about the state of our birds, and then I'm going to focus on an example of bird conservation in an agricultural landscape, focusing on the mountain plover. So I'm sure you're familiar with some of what you're seeing here, and but I will mention just the study that came out in 2019, which was published in Science, showing that we've lost nearly 3 billion birds since about 1970. And you can visit the website if you haven't already. There's a lot of great resources for people in everyday lives and how they can make changes to help benefit birds. It's really a great opportunity and a great communication and marketing message to engage folks that aren't already thinking about bird conservation or wildlife conservation. So there's just some very basic resources that are available. So if we drill down by bird guild, you can see on the bottom in the red box where grassland birds are in the steepest decline, at over half of all grassland birds lost since 1970. So if you think of the millions of years of evolution for many of these species to exist and thrive, and what it took to get to that state, in just 50 years, half of them are gone. That's quite daunting and devastating. So we actually use and think about birds as indicators of ecosystem health, which you all may be very familiar with that concept, and the environments, meaning, so when we're losing species, it triggers us to ask that question, why? And so we can explore and figure out that there's actually probably something more drastic occurring, perhaps in food resources where these birds are occupying, and that leads us to think about pesticide use and all kinds of factors. So of course, every guild here is declining, but if you look at the top at where the wetland bird guild is increasing, that is largely attributed, what I would say, to waterfowl management efforts and a lot of efforts to create and restore wetland habitat for water birds. So, or excuse me, for waterfowl in particular. So we've seen where habitat improvements on the ground and providing the necessary habitat can actually have a strong benefit. And so this graphic is quite interesting. If looking at everything within the black boundary there, so that black boundary is what we would define as the Great Plains of North America. So it includes all the short grass, mixed grass, and tall grass prairie. So the left is the breeding season, and it shows the density of species using the region during breeding, so about April through July or so. And you can see a lot of this is just for grassland birds, grassland songbirds. You can see that high cluster in northern USA there, and then into southern Canada. So that's the Northern Great Plains ecoregion. And there's a lot of intact grassland in that area. There's a lot of efforts to work within private lands conservation with public land entities to keep a lot of that grass intact. It's not very arable. It's not great farmland. And so that's a high concentration. And then on the right, then you'll see this is winter. So kind of flipping the coin, the intensity and the density increases in southern Texas a bit, but largely in the Chihuahuan Desert of Mexico. And that is an area where we have focused a lot of efforts with partners in Mexico for about 20 years or so. So it's very interesting to see this graphic and kind of think about maybe where are some areas to even begin targeting conservation, and then ask and try to address some research needs and questions. And so I won't belabor this. I think you're all aware, just general factors that affect loss of birds or largely habitat loss, which is sort of the catch-all for habitat conversion or changes, maybe habitat fragmentation, changes in vegetation species, just overall changes in the prairie ecology, increased pesticide use, more woody plant encroachment in areas where historically was prairie and trees weren't part of the ecosystem. So bringing in predators to new areas. And then changes in management, grazers, fire on the plains. Many of these birds evolved with livestock of some sort or wild ungulates. And so there are ways to mimic those pre-colonial conditions and actually use cattle, for example, as a management tool to improve habitat. So this graphic I really like. It really just shows the breadth of range that not just what vegetation type can bring in, but where you might find some species along this gradient. So if we look to the far left, we could just talk about mountain plover at the top, responds to heavy grazing, really bare or short grass or short vegetation, and does not have much tolerance for anything that gets too tall. So this is a good model that helps us think about where management can play a role, how birds can respond to different vegetation types as well. All right, so let's get to it and talk about this bird. I'm going to assume nothing and just give a little bit of a background on the species. We think of it as a shorebird, even though it's really not found at the beach. I mean, they will sometimes forage around dry playas, but they are highly associated with short grass prairie, the ecoregion, but also just anything, even from this photo that you can see on the top right, anything that's really bare ground, kind of beach-like conditions. I worked with piping plover and other plovers in North Carolina. And when I came out here, just open farm ground, fallow fields, it was the same situation. It felt very familiar. The birds are almost identical in their behaviors and their movements and their breeding ecology. So I used this for, I don't think I have to tell this group, but for a different webinar, but there is definitely some confusion. I've sometimes had calls that folks are very excited. They call me at the office if they've seen a mountain plover, but it doesn't, it's like in the middle of downtown Denver or something. It doesn't quite fit the habitat. So this urban doppelganger, the killdeer, is very, can be deceiving to new birders out in this region, especially. So yeah, just looking at the breeding range and even the wintering range, it's pretty localized. So it's endemic to the Great Plains, mostly on the eastern side of the Intermountain West here. And the wintering range is still pretty dispersed. They're not found kind of throughout those parts of northern Mexico. We're still working to learn and get a better handle of where they are through some partnerships with universities and graduate students in Mexico as well. It's a fairly rare bird. I will say the population estimate that we currently have is relatively old. It's probably more than a decade old, but I wouldn't think that it's much different than this. But it's always been, this species has never been in sort of modern record keeping in the millions of individuals. But yeah, about 20, maybe less than that individuals. And they're really high on the current watch lists, estimating maybe a loss of 3% per year. We also know that nearly 80% or more of the breeding population is in Colorado. So there have been a lot of efforts to work toward both understanding where they're occurring in Colorado and what are some of the threats. So they occupy Colorado for breeding, but they also, and I'll show this in some slides later on, they spend a lot of time during migration, staging, especially fall migration, and in the spring in the southern part, southeastern Colorado as well. They're very nomadic. So if they don't like what they see, essentially, when they're coming back in March and April, the breeding conditions have changed. They will find other situations if they can. Again, they're quite specialized, so they are very particular. There's a lot of farm ground in eastern Colorado, and a lot of their historical habitat, prairie dog towns, just heavily grazed rangeland. It doesn't quite exist in the amount that it did on the right. But at the same time, they can be extremely site faithful. So this photo on the right is actually a bird. In this photo, it's about 2 years old. It was banded as a chick. It was the only chick banded from a graduate student in that. I think he had banded a couple, maybe several chicks, but this was the only one that he had put the color bands to identify it as an individual. And let's see, so he banded it as a 2-week-old chick. And this is when it returned to almost near where it hatched. A birder this is up in southwest Nebraska, and a birder copied that photo for us. And so looking at this map, so here's the little guy when it was banded at 2 weeks old. And so you'll see this pin here on the left is the nest location of where it came from in 2014. And then in 2016, this is just where it was seen. We don't know if it had a nest, we never found it, but that record is kind of just a really cool indication even chicks coming back to their natal territories, which we don't have much information on for many species actually. Another example of this as well. Oh, and I'll just add that these squares are sections. So a section is 1 square mile on the landscape. You can see all the row crops in various forms. This darker kind of gray squares are probably CRP fields, Conservation Reserve Program. So that's grass. So yeah, so here we have a nest. This is a nest location. The adult was caught for a study, and this XIOR is the band, the color band combination. And then a year later, it put its nest maybe half a mile away, and was seen again and recaught for collection of morphology information and just trying to assess, comparing its measurements from one year to the other as part of a habitat use and survival study. So that was pretty cool. All right, so as I mentioned, prairie dog towns really occupied this landscape hundreds of years ago, 100, maybe 200 or so, and was a key breeding site use. They have, I would say, in fairly recent years, again, they're nomadic, so if things are changing, predation might be too high, or changes in management, loss of prairie dogs, then they're looking for alternatives. So these fallow farm fields, this photo on the right is just ideal plover habitat. I see that and I think, oh my gosh, there must be plovers everywhere. It's not ideal for many other birds, but this is anything that's growing and kind of tall is a little more than they're willing to deal with. We did have a year where vegetation was just sprouting crazy. May was enormously wet, and there were several nests that had, there were several birds that had created nests in growing corn. And I thought, there's no way they will stick around. They're going to abandon those nests. And they all hatched from these tall corn stalks. It was the craziest thing. But I think the habitat was just so limited because everything was growing. It was so wet that year. They have a kind of cool uniparental mating strategy. So this helps maximize their likelihood of breeding success. A female will lay 3 eggs in one scrape on the ground that a male has. The male creates the scrape, kind of decorates it for the female. And then she will lay 3 more eggs in a different scrape, and it might be by a different male. And so because she's doing this twice, each adult is responsible for feeding itself through incubation, and then and rearing and staying on the nest as much as possible, and then also rearing the chicks. I would say incubation is about 25 to 28 days or so. So that's a good month that they are responsible for this nest. And then when chicks hatch, it takes another month or so before they can fly. The chicks are precocial, so I mean, if you think about it, that obviously makes sense. They really need to be up and out of the nest. Most ground nesting birds on a nest so exposed like this one would need to be able to escape potential predators in the area. So an intern one year caught, this is just, I think, in a really short little video of their broken wing display, but it's always fun to show. Just turn, the volume doesn't, it's just wind. And this is a good video when for folks that are really unfamiliar with just what these birds are doing, and especially these sort of defensive movements. Yeah, so this adult is when they're doing this broken wing display, again, I probably don't have to describe it to you all, but they are just sending that signal to a potential predator that come get me, I'm injured, I'm weak. And so they're running off in a very different direction than where their brood is. They usually do this when they have chicks, not as much when they just have a nest. So I'll talk about that innovative technique that we employed back in 2003 and 2011. This species was proposed for listing under the Endangered Species Act as potentially threatened. And back then, the reasoning behind that proposal was mostly related to a lot of lack of information. There was really not much known about this species. And there was a massive effort to figure out where they are, what habitat they're using, how many of them there are, and even understand things like nest survival and chick survival. I think all those efforts are what precluded the listing. And it's unfortunate at times when a listing threat causes such a reaction rather than the proactive nature of conservation, where we don't have to get to that listing state. But that's where we were back then. And so one of the reactions to that was in response to a lot of these birds being picked up, counted really on farm ground, a lot of anecdotal information coming from farmers. Many of them were just huge advocates and just curious, and some were afraid of what a listing could mean for their land. So we worked for about 5 years with Colorado Parks and Wildlife, the Colorado Farm Bureau, probably a half dozen other partners that I'm just unfamiliar with. And really just had a huge effort in 10 counties, locating nests and marking nests, and then working on those private lands where we had permission to also track if those nests hatched and figure out if they're surviving on farm ground. The threat being with potential farm equipment during tillage seasons, potentially plowing up a nest. So it worked pretty well, and we then had a lot of interest in Nebraska because the species was listed there, I believe. It still is a very low population species in the state of Nebraska. It's just on the edge of their breeding range up there. And a sort of a serendipitous thing occurred. The biologist at the time ran into this guy at the top corner photo here, Larry, and he had seen these birds on his land. He really didn't think much of it. But months later, with a little funding, we were able to hire him, and he worked for Bird Conservancy for about 15 years. And he worked solely on collaborating and connecting with, he enrolled about 80 farmers. And enrolled, I say, we had permission to access their fields. And over that stretch of time, we had a huge success rate for both finding nests and nest hatching. And then just the outreach component to landowners was huge. We had at the time several, gosh, I can think of 5 off the top of my head, landowners that would find nests themselves. Like they're plowing, they're in the tractor, they're plowing, and they see a bird flush up and they can find the nest, and they got really good at it. Some of them really cared about these birds and the efforts. So let's talk about nest marking a little bit. So what that meant is we hired seasonal technicians, usually folks out of undergrad or so, to get some field experience. And it looks kind of like what you see here. We had 2 ATVs. We had a very large, like kind of a bungee rope tied between the two. The white bags helped flush up the bird. We really need to flush the adult in order to find the nest, if you can imagine that. But plovers they don't tend to fly away. They really, they want to know what's going on. They want to get back to their nest. So as soon as we see an adult, we just kind of back up and just sit for some time with binoculars, and the bird will just go back to sit on its nest. And one technician has their eye on the bird while the other walks out to mark nest area. So we mark it with a GPS, and the two little stakes in the center there under the arrow that says nest. And then there's very tall orange markers out a ways, maybe 30 feet or so. And these are placed in each of the 4 cardinal directions. This is for the farmer's benefit, really, on their tractor. They just need to see one of these, and all they have to, no matter what their rotation is or how they're farming, and all they need to do is miss the nest. So these birds can tolerate a good amount of disturbance, and they'll come back to the nest. As you can see, this little guy happily incubating on the left there. We've even had, we've come across nests that were tilled, but the eggs weren't crushed. And we've actually created a new nest and put them back, and they've hatched. So if the bird can find the nest, it will go back to doing what it's doing. This photo on the bottom where you see this sort of large patch, obviously that's the area that was not farmed. And we, one thing that came up in our discussions early on was, is this creating a potential trap? Are predators going to learn about these patches on the landscape or learn our behavior? But the farmers we talked to didn't seem to think so. There were patches all over the place that had nothing to do with us. So that didn't seem to be a source of concern. And predation was often very low for the years we worked. We also obviously had some strong interest in research efforts, really evaluating if all that nest marking effort was worth it. So we had done, I think this was back in the early 2000s, a nest survival study comparing unmarked dummy nests that were randomly placed on the landscape to marked mountain plover nests. And so we found quite a stark difference when nests were marked. We had a pretty high survival rate. And again, if they're hatching, that's great, but the chicks need to survive to fledge. So then we explored that research, and we tracked broods for, I believe, 3 summers. It was right before I started, with a fairly high success rate. 52% is, it's not the best, but it isn't terrible. And that's, replicating those studies is always a good idea. And we've looked at habitat use, comparing what habitat they're selecting, potentially why that might be. So in their range, in all the work that I worked on, I'll say, was all in Southwest Nebraska. So it was in a very one county with maybe a population of 2,000 birds, which is a lot for one county. And so that's where all of this information is coming from, is from that area. But in that county, I would say about 30% was in row crop agriculture, and the remaining 70% was in livestock or range operations. But I would say we rarely found birds on rangeland, and there was very little to almost no prairie dogs. So they were heavily utilizing the crop. We've looked at, a graduate student compared crop use on the Pawnee National Grasslands, or the crop is not on the Pawnee, but crop use compared to what's going on in the Pawnee. So I don't know if you're familiar, but the Pawnee grasslands was really a stronghold for the breeding population on the Eastern Plains for a number of years, for maybe a few decades, hundreds of birds, but they're essentially, viably, they're gone. There's maybe 5 to 10 birds every year. So there have been some drastic, I think, climate changes and maybe some management changes. So a grad student was trying to track where they were and where they weren't. So they're using a lot of that cropland. And then we've done some landowner surveys and worked with folks that have some experience in social science to understand what motivates farmers and how we can keep that motivation strong. So this is kind of a cool graphic on the right from our first grad student that was looking at habitat use, Colin Woolley. He now works for Bird Conservancy as our banding coordinator. So what I'll just show is everything in the red. The red dot is one individual, the adult, and its movements. So the red splotch here is the adult's home range when it's incubating. So I mentioned it's got to figure out how to feed itself and keep its nest going for about a month. And then when the nest hatched, everything in blue is then the brood movement. So this is kind of cool because you can even see how they're kind of moving diagonal and then heading south straight down following that row crop. We would often find broods kind of in and out of the fallow into the growing, maybe growing wheat, going back and forth to find food, to escape the sun, to get some shade, to escape predators. So it's quite a suitable landscape for them. Some things that we're working on now is we're working to expand our knowledge of migratory staging areas and winter sites, which has been poorly lacking. We've been doing this for about the past three to 4 years. And I mentioned we've got a graduate student with some joint funding with a partner in Mexico, and he was looking to identify population status. And actually he was able to fully confirm resident birds in Mexico through banding, birds that are there year round. So there's a lot of interesting information coming out of populations in Mexico. The photo on the top right is a PhD student's bird. She's been working in the South Park area where there's a high elevation population at 9,000 feet. There's maybe 2,000 to 4,000 individuals up there. And that South Park area is, as the crow flies, due south of Breckenridge. And so that bird she banded, and the following year, so she banded him sometime in June or July of, I can't remember the year, but then the following fall and winter, she went down to Mexico to help Julio, the student, and she saw this bird. So she saw her bird in Mexico, which was quite crazy. So some of the tag data that's come out of Allie's work, this map is kind of messy, so I'm going to walk you through it. But what we're looking at is the GPS tags are put on adults at the end of their incubation time. So they're about to leave for, the nests are about to hatch, and we can catch adults on their nests while they're incubating and really learn a lot about their population. So that's the time period when she's putting on these tags. And with these tags, the bird has to be caught again for the tag to be recovered, for the data to be pulled off the tag. We are advancing and have some not as invasive tags now that we don't have to catch the bird again. So that's great. The tags are getting smaller. So there's a cluster of birds. She mostly focused in South Park, as you can see, the center of Colorado. They're kind of all stacked together. This is where the birds started. Each color is an individual bird. And then there was one up at our, when we were working with partners up in Thunder Basin National Grassland, there was a bird caught on its nest up there. So that's where that one's coming from. And this was the time we really had any information about their migration staging. And none of these birds went to Mexico, but she saw one of her birds there. So we're pretty sure they're going there. But there's populations up in Montana. There's a lot of populations that are not represented here. One other really cool thing about what you're looking at is the path in red to California and the path in pink is actually the same bird. So she caught that bird one year, got the tag, and she actually put a tag on it the second year when it came back. So it had two very different routes. I don't know what it's doing up here in northwestern Colorado, but very interesting information. So there's this white square here focusing heavily on this cluster of Southeast Colorado. If we zoom in, we were really starting to learn, not only were they stopping here in the fall, but they were spending, they spend weeks down there. You all may even know that more than I do. I know a lot of birders go down to this area to look for plovers, but we really didn't have a lot of data before this effort. And this spans, I think she started in 2016 and it spans, I think, maybe to 2019. I can't fully remember, but they're spending weeks here in the fall. So that got us thinking about how can we focus, one, ground truthing, and then some potential conservation needs for that area. So Allie, the following fall, after we got her tag data back and we're learning this information, she went down to Southeast Colorado, Southwest Kansas for 2 falls. And she was able to detect nearly 1,500 individuals. And they're still using various crop components during fall migration, as we suspected as well. And then I've just got some fun slides here. Back when I was first starting with my work up in Nebraska, I thought it would be fun to put some cameras at nest locations to bring these birds to the farmers. So many of the farmers, it was a suite of different personality types. Those that just were interested, but really didn't have time to engage with us much, had never seen this bird, but they were totally fine with us surveying on their land, all the way to those that would come out when we would do banding and were very interested in what happened to these birds every year when they left for the fall. So again, I wanted to bring these guys to them a little bit. So this was kind of, it started as an outreach method, but I just pulled out, and then I was also interested in these off bouts when the adult is not incubating, and how long are they not incubating. And so I have some of that old data compiled, but I pulled out some cute ones, but you can see the adult clearly incubating. And there's a little chick to its, I guess to its left, to on our right of the bird, just kind of happily sitting there. Image at night, just kind of huddled. And then this one's one of my favorites. The adult, and it's banded. This adult it's got the eggshell in its mouth and it's carrying it away. So it's carrying away all evidence of scent, of anything that could attract a predator. And then you can see the nest in the center here of the photo. There's this little blob right in front of these 2 eggs in the back. So that's the new little wet chick. These guys, I mentioned they're precocial. They're probably up and out of then once all 3 eggs hatch. If they all will hatch, then they're usually up and out within, I'd say, a day or so, and just off getting food and getting new life experiences. I do want to mention the many graduate students that I've worked with on mountain plovers and also other various things, grassland birds of all sorts, and even the social science components. So I can't understate the value of the university partners over the years. The amazing photos from most of those students, of course, wouldn't be possible without them. And just in general, the power of the partnerships that we're able to, all these folks that we're able to work with in a variety of capacities as an organization. I mean, we really couldn't do most of what we can do without them. I'm sure I'm missing some of those folks. If you're familiar with the Carville Mountain Plover Festival, I think it's been canceled the last 2 years. I think due to weather and then due to COVID. So I do hope it makes a comeback this April 2021. But you can check that out at mountainploverfestival.com if you haven't heard of it. It's just a really great birding weekend. People, I think, come from, I think they've had folks from all over the world. World might be a stretch, but some, definitely a few international folks. And so thank you. Thanks for your time. If you have any further questions or you just want to follow up for anything, you're welcome to email me. You can also find my contact info on our website. And I will just leave you with this photo of various nest configurations by Mountain Plover. They're some detailed, they're just fun little birds to work with. And I'm happy to answer any questions if you have them.